Hey guys, my name is Tori and today I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up. I know it is a little bit late in the month for this, at least later than I usually do it, but I ended up moving out at the end of August. If you've seen my most recent vlog, you'll know about that. And because of that, I ended up taking an unplanned break from booktube. I didn't post for a couple weeks, I haven't filmed in ages, so hopefully I end up being able to verbalize my thoughts in a coherent way because it has been a very long time since I've sat in front of a camera, at least in this more formal way as opposed to my usual vlogging style. So anyway, let's just get right into this, starting with the first book I completed this month, which was Sold on a Monday by Kristina McMorris. Unfortunately, this was pretty middling for me. This story is based on an actual photograph that was taken during the Great Depression in America. And in this photo, we have a mother hiding her face on the porch while there are 4 children on the stairs and a sign that says 4 children for sale. And the author just wanted to give a better story to these children, so she created this story around it. They've changed a little bit, so there's only 2 children instead of 4. And we actually are following the perspective of 2 reporters who are connected with the story, one of whom has written it and the other of whom just motivated the editor to agree to print this story to allow this story into the newspaper. And we follow them as they deal with some of the outcomes of taking this photo. This was a very easy book to get through. It was very easy to read. I felt like it was very interesting to learn about this little event in history that I had never really heard about. I also have not read very much from the Great Depression, so it was interesting to get into that time period a little bit more. However, I just felt like it was very lackluster. Like, the writing style was a style that just doesn't really work for me. It kind of pulls me out of the story because it feels a little simplistic and almost unnatural. Like, there's a lot more cringy lines because of the writing style and just a lot of things going on with that. I also felt like the writing style didn't help to really push the characters into real focus for me. They ended up feeling very cliche as main characters and didn't really draw me in. Of course, they have a romance, it's a man and a woman, and I just didn't feel like I really cared that much about the romance. I felt like it was just very cliche. There wasn't anything that really had it stand out. I mean, I didn't hate it, but I just didn't feel like it was that great either. And the characters themselves I felt very similarly about. There was one character that I found really interesting who has some mental health struggles. In some ways, she kind of plays a villain in the story, and I just feel like if we had gotten a perspective from her, it would have made the story that much more full and rich, and I just feel like I would have enjoyed it more, but we don't get that perspective, and I feel like her character could have been explored a lot more than it was, and it just ended up being kind of disappointing for lack of that. Do I regret reading it? No. I feel like it was a very interesting book, like I said, and it was very easy to get through. It was pretty fast-paced for a book of this style, and there were really good themes of motherhood throughout the story that I really appreciated and enjoyed, but it was pretty lackluster on the whole to me, unfortunately. So if it's something you're interested in, give it a try. You may enjoy it more than me, particularly as I know this was a pretty popular book a few years ago. It showed up on a lot of Goodreads lists and other things, so you may really enjoy it, like I said, but for me, unfortunately, it was pretty lackluster. The second book I completed this month was When Women Ruled the World by Cooney, which is a nonfiction about female pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Specifically, I think it focused on about 5 or 6 of these female pharaohs and their experience, or what we know of it, or what we can guess about it as well. And unfortunately, this really disappointed me. I think I gave it like 2.5 stars. I read this book to learn about the female pharaohs of ancient Egypt and really about ancient Egypt in a way that I just haven't really explored it before. However, Cooney felt like she wanted to input a lot of her personal political views into this book and her personal view on feminism into this book a lot, and use the female pharaohs of ancient Egypt as examples of some of the things she's arguing for or against. And while that didn't necessarily take up most of the book, it was present enough that it got really irritating. And it kind of dated this book a little bit because she's talking a lot about Hillary Clinton versus Trump, which obviously we are far enough away from that year that it's not quite as relevant anymore. Maybe on some level it is, but not much, and so it feels like a little dated because of that. Additionally, I read this to find out about ancient Egypt. That's what I was reading about. I read this for the sake of what it was trying to teach me about these female pharaohs. I don't care what her political opinions are. Even if I agreed with some of it, I just it was just interrupting my expectation and what I wanted to learn from this book. Those sorts of topics I feel like should be addressed maybe a couple times throughout the book, but mostly in the introduction and conclusion. And I just felt like she addressed it so much in the book to a point where it was really unnecessary and honestly took the focus of the book away from what I, and I'm sure everybody else, would expect it to be. So yes, I ended up rating this pretty low. I will say that I did still learn things from it, which is why it's not like a 1 star. It wasn't totally being taken over by her political opinions. I was still able to learn a good deal about ancient Egypt and some of these female pharaohs that I didn't know before, but a lot of those political opinions and arguments really took me out of what I was reading the book for, unfortunately. The rest of the month went really well, however. I had a lot of great reads, so let's get into that, the more positive side of my reading month. The next book I completed was Elektra by Jennifer Saint, which I absolutely adored. I think I gave it like 4.5 out of 5 stars. This one follows the story of Elektra from Greek mythology, as well as her mother Clytemnestra and Cassandra the Seer. This myth is told in the Oresteia by Aeschylus, so if you're curious about what myth I'm talking about, that's where you can find it. It's also mildly hinted at in the Odyssey by Homer, so that's another place you can reflect on some of those things about Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. But this ended up being a really great book. I did read Ariadne a few years ago when that was released by Jennifer Saint. It was her debut novel. And unfortunately, like many others, I was disappointed in it. I think I liked it more than a lot of my fellow booktubers who discussed it, but I still was also disappointed like they were. But this one definitely won me over. I'm so glad that I gave her another chance because this one really did very well for this particular myth, and I think she just, yeah, I think she did a great job with it. There were, of course, moments where this book was really frustrating, but I think it's just in the nature of the myth itself. Like, Elektra and Clytemnestra, if you know the myth, are both on extreme opposite sides of this family issue, and it's very interesting to see both sides and how they're feeling about it. But it's very frustrating because they're not willing to listen to each other. They're not willing to interact as a mother and daughter should. A lot of it is Clytemnestra's fault because she lets her grief overwhelm her ability to be a present mother for Elektra. However, you can also understand why Clytemnestra would react the way she does to this horrible event that occurs in their family. So yes, it's a lot of emotions, a lot of psychology, a lot of relationships being delved into. My favorite perspective was actually probably Cassandra. I just felt really bad for her, first of all, but also it was in a way that it wasn't just like, oh, I pity you. It was in a way where I can just see her strength of character and how much she is overcoming. And I just really liked her voice, honestly. I would say, yeah, she's my favorite. Clytemnestra was probably my second favorite perspective, and Elektra was my third favorite. But that being said, I didn't dislike any of the perspectives. I didn't dislike Elektra's perspective. It was still just as engaging as the others. I just think I really felt for the other two characters a little bit more and felt more engaged in their stories and their psychological experiences with everything, but Elektra was still wonderful to read about and read from her perspective. And yes, basically this was amazing. I'm glad I read it. Not as good as Circe by Madeline Miller or The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek, but still very good, and I'm excited to see what Jennifer Saint does in the future and see if hopefully she'll continue to impress me rather than disappointing me again like with Ariadne. Then I reread a favorite, well, I listened to it on audiobook, and that was Agnes Gray by Brontë, and I still absolutely love this book. This story follows Agnes Gray as she grows up, her family is struggling, and she decides to go serve as a governess in a couple different households. And unfortunately, even though she goes in with very high expectations for her experience, it does not go the way she would have wanted. It's a very sweet and mild story. There's not a lot of drama, but I love Agnes as a character. I really find the relationships in this book that are explored to be very interesting and dynamic, even though it's very short, so we don't necessarily delve into them super deeply. And Brontë writes in a way that you can easily imagine some of the complications and depth of these relationships, even if it's not necessarily shown to great extent on the page. And I really appreciate that about Anne's writing. It's much more simplistic than her sisters, but it just does the job. And I just feel like she really puts her heart into her books, and that's something I love to read when I read her books. And now I don't know what my favorite Brontë novel is, because I feel like between this one, Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I am currently rereading, they're all so good in different ways, and I just feel like depending on my mood, a different one will stand out to me. So really those three are all my favorites at this point. But this really was a great reread. I really enjoyed it. And if you haven't read Agnes Gray, definitely give it a try, especially if you're in the mood for a shorter, sweeter Victorian work. This could be just what you need. Next, I read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and this one I ended up really enjoying as well. I am not a horror reader or watcher in any way. I really don't like horror very much because I'm such a scaredy cat and my overactive imagination ends up torturing me at night when I do read or watch horror, so I avoid it as much as possible. However, I have read a couple other things by Shirley Jackson, and I've read some classic horror, and I feel like it just works a little bit better for me. This did give me nightmares, not going to lie, but I think I handled it a little bit better than some other books and films that I've seen regarding horror. So anyway, this is basically a haunted house story, and we follow a group of 4 individuals who end up going to this house to study the phenomena, the supernatural, paranormal phenomena that is going on in this house. We are primarily in the perspective of Eleanor, who is very strange, and even before she goes to the house, you can tell she has some mental health challenges, and that really played into the story, which I really loved. I think my favorite things about this book were the atmosphere and the character of the house. I just felt like it was built up so well by Shirley Jackson. You could just feel how eerie and creepy it was, but it wasn't overly like jump scary, it wasn't overly dramatic, it was just very mild things that just felt very eerie and built up this great atmosphere. And then, like I said, the theme of mental health and mental illness is really present in this book in a way that just is really interesting to think about. I am not a licensed psychologist, so take what I say with this with a grain of salt, although I do have a bachelor's degree in psychology, so I at least have some level of experience with learning about psychology. And I honestly feel like Eleanor might have like borderline personality disorder along with depression and possibly anxiety as well, and that really plays into the story and her relationships with the other characters, which actually brings me to a few things I didn't like about this book. I felt like the relationships with the characters were really weird and they would just change so much, and I just didn't really understand why these characters would speak to each other in certain ways, why they would behave towards each other in certain ways. They almost become really close really fast in a way that just felt unnatural, and maybe part of that is being in Eleanor's head. She is just all over the place in her emotions and her feelings about her relationships because of the borderline personality disorder, if that's what she has, but the relationships and the way they're perceived would definitely make sense with that diagnosis. And outside of the relationships, I just felt like I couldn't really grasp any of the characters' personalities. Like, they just felt very distant from me besides Eleanor, and I would say the other female that's in the house, I can't even remember her name. Theodora is her name, and I felt like we got a little bit of her, but I feel like it was just sort of stilted in the way we're able to learn about her. And again, maybe that's because we're following Eleanor's perspective more than anything else, but it just felt really strange and was hard for me to wrap my head around what was going on, why people were saying what they were saying, why the dialogue went the way it went. It just, yeah. There were certain parts that things were clearer, but then other moments where I was like, what is going on? What are you talking about? Why are you talking to each other that way? And yeah, very interesting and strange. But again, that may have been playing into Eleanor's mental health, which just adds to the complexity of, is the house really doing some of these things, or is Eleanor herself doing some of these things because she's just unwell? So yes, really enjoyed it. I will say I think We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson is still my favorite between the two, but I did really enjoy this and I'm glad I read it. And the final book I completed this month was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, which I was reading throughout the month. It was the final book on my list of Victorian reads to read before next Victober, which is great because I have about a month left before Victober starts. And like I said, I really enjoyed this. This follows the mystery of this moonstone that was stolen from India and ends up falling into the hands of this young girl on her birthday and then goes missing that night. And we actually follow multiple perspectives. It's actually like someone is pulling together personally recorded experiences from this time and accumulating them into a story. So we start off with the perspective of the butler, which is a great place to start because he just has such an insight into the characters that others wouldn't, due to his closeness to the family, but still a little bit more distant than if he was actually part of the family. He's also a very humorous character, so it was fun to see things from his perspective in general. Of course, there is a lack of sensitivity and understanding to the Indian characters throughout this book and Hindu culture in general, and yeah, it was just very sad to see that, but it did still bring up some interesting questions and thoughts in my mind as I was reading, so there was that. There's also some disabled characters in this, which actually weren't portrayed that terribly compared to some other works that I've read. A lot of the times these characters are either seen as being super bad or super good and angelic, and in this book they're actually just very intense people, but I wouldn't say they're evil in any way. They just are very separated from everybody else, and that was part of the issue with it actually, was even the author almost treated them as very other, as almost not quite as human as the people who were whole, and so there was a little aspect of that, again, not seriously described that way in the book or anything, but there was just a hint of that within the writing style and the scenes that these characters were in, but they were overall a little more nuanced than I feel like other characters with similar disabilities are in other books I've read. The mystery itself was very engaging. I definitely had a lot of moments of being shocked and surprised and wondering what the heck was going on, so it kept me engaged that way. I will say part of the resolution to the mystery was a little strange to me and I didn't particularly like it, but I just suspended my disbelief a little bit and was still able to enjoy the overall story. I found Rachel as a main female character. We don't get her perspective at all, but she is in pretty much everybody's perspective because she's the one that receives the Moonstone, so she's very central to this mystery. And I really enjoyed being able to see her through multiple other perspectives because I think we were able to see many different sides to her, from people who like her, from people who don't, from people who are related to her, from people who are servants to her, and someone who is in love with her. And so it makes her a much more fleshed out character than I think sometimes women are in, at least in The Woman in White. The women, there was only one woman who was really fleshed out. The other two women who were main characters in that book weren't as fleshed out as I think they could have been. And I don't necessarily think Rachel was super well fleshed out necessarily, but I do feel like it was interesting to think about her as we're seeing her through these different perspectives and what her personality is really like. So yes, overall a great read and one I would definitely recommend for this Victober if you haven't read it and are just in the mood for a good mystery. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, your thoughts on them, as I would love to know. Also, if you have any recommendations based on how I felt about the books in this video, please let me know that as well, as I'm always looking for more recommendations. Thank you again so much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye!